So this virus has been amazing because it's allowed us to do these Zoom meetings, and it's just been incredible. I wanted to have Stephen out here forever, but since we don't have a budget, it's not like we could fly him out. So when the opportunity came to do this by Zoom, I immediately reached out and said, would you be willing to do this? And he said, well, normally I charge about $10,000, but for you, Mo, I'll do it for free. I'm kidding. Yeah. But no.
Sounds good.
Yeah, normally he does. He gets big bucks to do this. So this is like a real treat that he's willing to do this for us. And we're going to give him a really nice bottle of wine. So, everybody knows Stephen, I think, from the book Adrift. When he hit a submerged object and drifted across the Atlantic Ocean in his life raft. It's a incredibly riveting boat. It was amazing for me when I read the book, and then I met Stephen, I don't know, 15 years later. He was been friends in the past with a good friend of mine. And I remember meeting you on the docks, Stephen, and you were wearing your talisman, that New Zealand thing. And I was like, well, that's the same thing he had on his pictures of himself from the book. I was like, oh my God, this really is Steve Callahan. But more than that, he's also a boat designer. And he does some amazing little skiffs. He's an artist, an incredibly gifted artist. He was an editor at Cruising World, and also a judge for Best Boat of the Year every year at Cruising World. And so with that, I am beside myself that we have Stephen Callahan here tonight. And plus I get to see his face again. I just can't hug him. But anyway, Stephen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mo, and thanks to the whole Yacht Club for having me. I'm not going to recount all the details of Adrift, of course, but as I was telling Mo just before this, the sea has become my perfect metaphor for life. I see things as much more fluid than solid, and I take a certain amount of joy knowing that even the dry, what we consider dry, solid land goes up and down a little with every tide, and everything kind of joins together. So I will, let me see, it's going to take me a second here to get this. So I was asked a few years ago to speak at the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival with Lynn and Larry Pardee, and we were asked to present the adventure that changed my life, which for many people is a single event, but for me it's difficult to separate them all. Most people, of course, know me for my book Adrift, which is shockingly now, 34 years in print, something like that, which chronicles my 76-day drift across half the Atlantic in a life raft, learning to live like an aquatic caveman. Of course, this was back in the Stone Age of 1982, and it's definitely not a recommended way to cross half the Atlantic. When people first asked me when I got ashore, how did I survive? I boiled it down to three basic things: preparation, equipment, and luck. I'll expand upon that a little bit when I talk more about the experience itself. But that was 2.5 months of 50+ year, or at least so-called career, messing around in boats. And I considered everything up to that point preparation. After all, isn't sailing offshore just some kind of a glorified survival voyage? I found when going offshore that Murphy's Law is actually pretty optimistic, because not only can everything that can go wrong, but even the things that can't possibly go wrong find a way of going wrong. So it's good training for a survival voyage. Were these years spent, these 50 years, as worthwhile as what Water Rat suggested in Wind of the Willows? I'm not really sure. I don't claim any particular superior skills or accomplishments. I've been blessed, though, to somehow win my way through life to have interviewed and sailed with and even become friends with some of the great sailors, designers, builders, adventurers of our era. I consider myself more like a Forrest Gump kind of character, where I've been sort of a half-witless witness to the post-war era of sailing. And I guess it shouldn't have been a huge surprise, but it was when about 4 or 5 years ago, Mystic Seaport Museum called me up and was interested in, quote, my papers, whatever they might be. Now, I'd written hundreds of articles and a couple of books, and they were interested in manuscripts, but they were interested in interview tapes I've had of greats from Jean-Marie Finot to Olin Stevens, and I guess I've gathered quite a lot of stuff. So it was, first of all, very flattering that they thought I have something worthwhile. But it was also a bit of a shock because what they were telling me was I'm literally history now. And so I guess we will go back in history a bit. Oops, sorry. I guess my age now and my perspective brings to mind the old joke that when I glance in the mirror, I say, "Dad, what are you doing in there?" Here I am in 1953-ish, about 1 year of age with my father. He came from Appalachia. I grew up in the Depression, my mother as well. And his whole family worked in the coal mines. He was determined to get out of there and settled in New England, went to the war, Second World War, of course, and came back through the GI Bill and became an architect. And fortunately for me, they settled in Massachusetts when he loved the ocean. So even well before I ever started sailing, I got a good taste of the water, loved the water from the very beginning, but he knew nothing about boats. What we did know about was being outside. Our family bought 6 acres of raw land, mostly wooded, with an old dried lake bed that was spring fed. We created a pond, and the whole town, over half the town, was woods. So I grew up running around outside in the woods and joined the Boy Scouts at age 11. And our scoutmaster was a very, I think, a great mentor. He allowed the boys, in fact, demanded that the boys plan everything, meetings, and we were very active in mountain climbing, canoe trips, and things like that. And I felt very much at home and at peace when I was in the wilderness. When I was about 12, Arthur, pictured here on the right, Arthur Adams, he had a little day sailor, an O'Day day sailor, 15-footer, and we would sail it off the coast until we couldn't see anything. And couldn't see land anymore. And I fell in love with it right away. It felt at home to me. And I moved up. I ended up crewing with him into my college years. He went from the day sailor into a O'Day Mariner, pictured at the bottom. I think I'm about 16, 15, 16 here, something like that, sailing off a Mount Desert Island in Maine and learning to camp cruise. And that's how I fell in love with Maine. And later on, a Cal 25, which we would sail up from Boston. And Arthur had enough trust in me that he actually loaned me his boat whenever I wanted it. And I started single-handing along the coast of Maine before I even got out of high school. I don't think he quite knew everything I was doing with his boat, but fortunately I kept it afloat. While other boys were taken with cars, I was completely committed to the sailing life. I thought boats were an incredible tool, and not an end in themselves, but an incredible tool to reach 2/3 of the world. And sailing has always kind of reflected society and what's going on in society to me. And in this post-war era, it was a great democratization of sailing. A lot of production boats could be afforded by middle-class people, and a lot of people were building their own dreams. It was a fundamentally important era for the development of multi-hulls, which at the time were not really embraced by the yachting community, let's say. In fact, quite shunned by most. And my high school job was helping to build a Robert Harris 41-foot trimaran, the Barbara Ann, which sailed all along the New England coast, did a lot of racing, races off to Bermuda and those sorts of things. I never actually sailed that boat to Bermuda, but sailed with it later on. And I was taken with all kinds of new designs and new concepts that were all a little bit out of the box. I was reading a lot of Amateur Yacht Research Society stuff. There wasn't that much in the way of literature. I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was Yachting Magazine when I was a boy, and that was it. Well, there was Rudder and Yachting. And Sail Magazine was actually created in Boston as more of a being teaching tool to teach everybody. Here's how you can go out and sail and have a boat. And there weren't even a lot of books around. I was reading, the Hiscocks, one of the first cruising couples to make voyaging into a lifestyle, popularized. And other books like that really intrigued me from Kon-Tiki, and there were a number of raft voyages in the 50s and the 60s, which I thought was incredible because it was more about being there in the environment than it was about getting someplace. But I also was enamored with the tales of John Guswell rounding the world in the 21-foot Trekka, and especially with Robert Manry's Tinkerbell. Here's a average guy with a copy editor who took a 13.5-foot town class sloop made for sailing around the pond, basically, and he sailed it across the pond to England. And that taught me a really important lesson that adventure was available to anybody with a mind for it. And you didn't have to be particularly wealthy, and it might even be an advantage not to be all that smart. So that suited me perfectly. When I got out of college, I was thinking about building my own boat. There was a recession on. I started as a welder's helper in a shipyard, but I had the opportunity to build a boat, and there was a gentleman, Jim Brown, so-called Trammer Jim Brown, who got his start out on your coast, who was building, designing boats for people to build themselves and go off in what he coined as seasteading. Now, it was the back to the land movement. A lot of people were moving back, farming and doing things like that. But seasteading was probably the life for me. And little did I know at that time that Jim and his whole family would become friends. A dear man who's a really important pioneer in the multi-hull movement. I myself built Cross 28 trimaran. And for my first wife, who's pictured on the bow here, and myself, it served us as a home for several years. One thing that I was able to learn was that this was a great compromise boat. It had enough accommodation that we could live aboard it, although in a fairly Spartan manner. And it was also a good performer. We could pretty much outsail any monohull our size, and in fact could keep up with like an Erickson 41 on anything but dead upwind. And we didn't do badly going upwind either. And unlike all the old saws about how multi-hulls can't tack and they can't go upwind, we did quite well with this boat. It was the first boat we took offshore. Here on the left, I'm in the middle here, and we are checking a chronometer. If anybody remembers chronometer, I remember when the first Texas Instrument electronic watch came out, and all my buddies were just like nuts about them, even though we had to keep them in plastic bags because they were so cheap and they were so accurate. And it made life a lot easier. Of course, we had no electronics to speak of, nothing like today. You had to watch the barometer to tell what the weather was doing. And I had learned with Arthur to navigate, to pilot, very carefully estimating, watching signs for in the water for currents, to judge the speed of the boat, even in thick fog. We had, the only thing we ever had on board was an RDF, which was pretty useless unless you were actually going straight at an RDF station. The first Loran we used on the Barbara Ann, the 40-foot trimaran, was as large as a chest of drawers. And you had to line up the sine waves and all this stuff. So getting around was a lot more complicated than it is now. But I loved it. And I sailed that boat a couple of times back and forth to Bermuda, including once single-handed. And I discovered that not very far offshore, just a few miles offshore, it's a whole other world out there. And it really is a fantastic wilderness. Eventually, we were living aboard in Salem, Marblehead, Beverly area on the East Coast. Ted Hood was in Marblehead. Everybody we knew worked as sail consultants or boat builders or boat designers or something. My wife worked at Hood's Sail Loft. And of course, we saw the 12s out here. Here's Courageous sailing off of Marblehead. And they were beautiful. But to our mind at the time, the 12 meters were dinosaurs. We too used to take a bit of delight. This guy used to come sailing out of Marblehead Harbor with his, $1,000 Hobie Cat, and other than going upwind, could sail circles around the 12s. And yet they were majestic, and I never saw anything move quite so wonderfully through the water, especially in light airs. And of course, the crew was fabulous. In 1979 or thereabouts, we were doing another Bermuda race, and this time it was on FT, a boat that had been built for the Round Britain race. Now, I was incredibly taken with the shorthanded racing scene offshore. To me, it was there was nothing like it in terms of development of designs and equipment. A lot of things that we take for granted now: autopilot, self-steering wind vanes, rope clutches, self-tailing winches. The list goes on and on and on. All came from this scene originally, or were highly refined by it. And of course, the multi-hull. The multi-hull at that time was gaining some steam. In the background here, you see at the end of the dock, Third Turtle, which is Dick Newick's revolutionary little day sailor that placed, I believe she placed third in a single-handed transatlantic race. And forward to her is the old Barbara Ann, the boat I helped build in high school. And this is just before one of the Bermuda races. Now, FT was a fantastic boat in this era. Of course, if you got a 35-foot boat going 15, 16 knots, you thought you were really flying. And this boat was capable at times of touching about 20 knots. But as you can see, she was pretty wet. In fact, the wettest boat I ever sailed. And all of this was teaching me something. Every boat I got on, it had nothing to do with how many hulls it had or what its general configuration was as far as whether it was a good boat or not. I was learning with every boat that each has its own personality. And what I would learn even more so later is that the number one enemy of survival is denial. And I think the number one enemy of the offshore sailor is denial. You have to accept things for what they are, the weather and what your boat is capable of. And so we exploited this boat, drove it like crazy, and actually managed to win the Bermuda race. But it may sound a little bit impressive, but without going into great detail, it was more like the Keystone Cops got aboard a boat and somehow managed to get it to Bermuda. But it was a good old time. And I continued doing deliveries and things like that. But my first wife and I were a little tired of the whole sailing scene, frankly. It was like everything everybody talked about was boats, 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 boats. It's like nothing ever else existed. And so we moved to Maine and did the homesteading thing. I had big organic gardens, but I wasn't off the water entirely. Here's my my wonderful development, the $40, 40-hour junker. A proa built out of the ama, or the outer hull was built out of paper mache with a bunch of old resin I had from helping to other people build their boats, and we had a good time with it. But my real dream was to follow in Robert Manry's steps, and that was always to take a small boat across the ocean. As I say, you know, I was taken with boats as a unique kind of structure. It's sort of a mixture of vehicle and dwelling and art to me. And I was very interested in efficient use of materials and energy and all those things. So this was sort of my aquatic version of the tiny house movement back then. And so I figured, well, the 21-footer is big enough if you're clever enough in designing it that you can actually live on it for extended periods of time. And in the 60s, like the Hiscocks used to say, well, you know, your average, if you average 100 miles a day at sea, that's pretty average for a cruiser. And yet design was moving on. Things were getting lighter. We were developing cold molded construction, much more refined with epoxies and things like that. And composites, of course, even some of the early uses of carbon fiber. So we sold the Trimaran, and I put everything I had into the Napoleon Solo, pictured here. And she had features like where I'm sitting in the little drawing there. I could steer. I could basically control the entire boat from inside the boat, because I figured the biggest risk offshore is really losing somebody overboard. And if you can stay inside the boat, control the boat from there, that's a huge safety feature. She also fortunately had a bunch of watertight compartments in it, and a very small cockpit that opened up the interior quite a lot. Here she is pictured sailing in Marblehead doing trials before her Atlantic crossing. And here's the interior. Interiors, to me, from a design standpoint, have three basic requirements: a good place to sleep, an efficient place to navigate, and a place to cook. That's it. Everything else is gravy. And she was very comfortable inside. And in fact, while cruising after I dropped out of the Mini Transat in Europe, I remember one night we were gathered with a bunch of French people, and we must have had about 10 people below on this boat. She was a great cruising boat. Here she is pictured on the left. She's in England. Bottom left, she's leaving England. And on the right, in the Canary Islands in 1982, shortly before I would leave on her ill-fated voyage. But she was a wonderful cruising boat, in large part because she was not off-putting to the locals. Everywhere I went, I would wake up in the morning and I would look up at the quay and I would see the bottoms of boots. And they were the local fishermen waiting for me to get up so they could chat with me, because they couldn't believe I'd sailed this thing from England. And of course, that gave me a great into them and their work and what was going on in the local scene. Oops. So I left the Canaries in January of 1982. We had done 10,000 miles together, the boat and I, and gone through several gales, and I felt pretty good about it, and was having what I consider a pretty rare week in that I was just exercising, reading books, really very low stress. But the conditions worsened, and on the night of, let me see, I'm trying to remember now. I think it was February 4th, 2 days before my 30th birthday. This is what I imagined happened. Now, when we were sailing FT, we had struck a sperm whale in broad daylight, and a number of people I known had hit whales before, and I'd certainly sailed very close to them many times. So still to this day, I think the most likely explanation was that for Solo's demise was that I was just sailing along, minding my business in fairly big seas, about 3-meter seas, and all breaking, and a whale was probably, or sea monster or something, was swimming in the other direction, minding its own business, and clunk. And of course, I lost the boat. I spent Fortunately, the way the boat went down, it developed an airlock in the back, and that combined with the watertight compartments kept it a bit afloat. But of course, all the seas were washing right over it, so I couldn't stay aboard. I inflated the life raft, which of course says, you know, toss overboard and before inflation. But for me, fortunately, this 100-pound thing was very difficult to maneuver, but overboard would happen to be on board at the time. So I just inflated it and kind of slid it off the side, and then took the chance to go back aboard, dive down inside, and get some critical equipment. During this next 2.5 months, of course, like I say, it's kind of like living like an aquatic cave person. Gone are all your wants and desires, and you kind of focus on your absolute needs. I had to ration my water, food, use of energy, all these things. And of course, I'd be tested during this voyage, both by aquatic life, like, you know, sharks coming up underneath and bashing into the raft and things like that. But slowly but surely, the thing that happens that keeps us alive in these kind of situations is that an ecology develops. I've seen light bulbs afloat that have been there for months and months and months, that grow long grass on them, and that the barnacles grow, and that attracts fish. I remember when we were crossing on Solo, there was a little square of styrofoam that Chris and I went by, and there was about a foot-long fish parked under it. And we were going very slow at the time. We wandered over and picked up the styrofoam, and the fish was like darting all over the place, wondering what we had done with its home. So we put it back in the water, and the fish went right back under it. And this is what we rely upon as long-term ocean survivors. This ecology develops, barnacles start growing, and fish start gathering around it. And for me, that would be the Dorado. The Dorado or mahi-mahi would prove themselves worthy adversaries as well as friends. They were quite smart, and I was envious of them. And in fact, as the voyage lengthened, I would grow to, I don't know, kind of worship them in a way, if you will, because they were, after all, that was their domain. They were out there playing, making love, having a good time, and I was dying. But they also kept me alive. They were my food source. Of course, I fished for them. I tried with hooks, and that did not work. They were too smart and too powerful. But I did buy this little spear gun, sort of little shorty spear gun, almost a toy, in the Canary Islands before I left. And I kept I kept putting it in different places in the boat and kept bumping my head on it. And I finally said, oh, well, what do I do with it? I'll put it in my ditch kit. I had this big bag with all kinds of equipment in it, and it just slid in there. And fortunately it did, because it would provide me with virtually all of my food, other than a couple of birds I caught by hand. And but of course the Dorado are pretty smart and powerful, and kept breaking it. So the diagram on the right is how the spear gun evolved over this time. And on the left is Rubber Ducky, my Rubber Ducky 3, my trusty life raft. And it was an Avon 6-person life raft. A lot of people kind of made fun of me when I was on Napoleon Solo, going, you're sailing this thing around a lot of times alone or with one other person. Why are you doing with this big life raft on there? And I said, well, have you ever gotten in a life raft? I actually had, with 3 other people, and we just looked at each other and said, hope we're never actually in one of these things for real. So I had about enough space for myself in it. It would have been very crowded with 2 people. But it served me for the voyage across the Atlantic. Here's a chart of where the boat went down, about 800 miles west of the Canaries. And I ended up drifting with the wind and with the current all the way to the Caribbean. A lot of adrift has to do with, if there's kind of themes in adrift, one of them is that I found myself surrounded by paradox and irony all the time. If it blew hard, I was drifting quickly towards my destination. However, that meant it was really hard to fish, to produce water, and do all those other things. If it was really hot and still, it was wonderful. I could dry out, cure salt water source to a certain degree, fish more efficiently, and make water. But it meant I wasn't going anywhere. If I had been blown south, I could have gotten to the Cabo Verde Islands in 400 miles or so. So I had the longest way possible to go before reaching landfall. But fortunately for me, I was pushed steadily by the currents in the wind, and 76 days later, washed up on Marie Gallant. Now, during the voyage, I had to be somewhat inventive. As I said, I thought sailing was pretty good training. And plus, I had grown up running around in the woods, being in isolated environments with limited resources. And so I had learned a lot of basic skills, including what my friend Alva Simon calls natural literacy. And he uses, I don't know, as a couple of examples of that, like when fishermen go out and they see birds hovering, they go, oh, well, there's a sign that there are fish under there. You can read currents in on the surface of the water. I had read and practiced a number of techniques that were written about by Dr. David Lewis and We the Navigators, that looked at traditional Polynesian and Micronesian navigation techniques, looking at wave shapes, refraction of waves off of distant land, cloud formations, and all those sorts of things. All of that came into play during this crossing. When people ask me, like, what important equipment did I have? Well, obviously the spear gun. I had solar stills that produced fresh water, although I've never ever talked to another person who's ever gotten one to work in the real world, at least not the World War II vintage ones that I had. But they were just enough production of water to keep me alive. But amongst the essential gear, I considered paper and pencils. On the left is some little excerpts from my logs. You'll see in one of those is like a little spaceship. And that's because I felt often as isolated and alone in the middle of the ocean as astronauts circling the globe. And there were times where I felt like I was riding this little circular spaceship across the ocean, surrounded by stars, and especially in those eerie times where things are very, very still in the middle of the sea. And even if the sea is always breathing, there were reflections of the stars in the water. And it can be very disconcerting at times. It's almost like you're floating in a bowl of stars, which be brought back to life many years later when working on a film. But the reason why I consider paper and pencils amongst the most, important survival equipment for me was that story is the bedrock of human meaning. Real life is chaos, and yet we conjure these stories from it. So even while I was in the raft, not only did the paper and pencils allow me to do navigational problems and things like that, practical things, but also to create dreams for the future for when I got out of that situation. And also to find within it, to be almost distance myself from the physical part of me, and be able to observe this incredible world these wondrous fish and amazing starlit skies at night, bioluminescence. Like the fish, I'd get up in the middle of the night and look out around the raft, and the whole school of fish would gather around the raft, and they'd be like these silver platters glowing under the ocean. And I realized that although I was alone and very lonely, that sometimes witnessing things, being the only person to witness them, also has its own kind of wonder. But the other thing that I learned about myself was that I needed people a lot more than I ever thought I did. I was very much a loner growing up, awkward, small kid, and spending a lot of time by myself. But in this case, my world, although a natural world, and although it was here, it's kind of a figurative drawing of the Dorado, where that spirits are dwarfing mine. I realized that I was very much a person, and I wanted to come back and be more of a participant in society than I had been. Fortunately, on the 75th night, I saw the loom of lights, and then the next morning, I was expecting possibly to see land in the far distance, but in fact, I was only about 5 or 10 miles out. I could see details of the island dead ahead of me, but it would have been an incredibly dangerous landing. There were coral cliffs. 3,000 miles of oceans were crashing on these cliffs on the whole north side of the island. And then the south side was a very enticing beach, but as typical in the Caribbean, there's a big reef outside of that. So I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get around it. And here the Dorado again. Now the Dorado at one point had broken my spear and put a big hole in the bottom of the raft, which just about did me in after struggling to fix that for about 10 days. So they provided me with my sustenance. They'd become my friends. I knew many of them individually by behavior patterns, as well as colors and scars and things like that. And in the end, they brought my salvation, because these local fishermen came out. It was the first time they'd ever fished on the windward side of the island. They came out and they saw birds hovering in the sky and said, oh, well, there are fish under there. And they came out, and there I was. And I had very little to offer them. And it was not really a rational decision, but I said, you guys got to fish. This is the best fish in the ocean are right here. So they buzzed around and caught my Dorado. I felt a bit like a Judas, frankly, about it, but somehow it made sense that I was extending this the spirit of the Dorado to these men who were there living almost as simply as I was, and it was a way of sharing that with other people. When I got ashore, I'd lost about a third of my weight. I thought I was looking pretty good, but I know I was pretty skinny. I wore a pair of pants that I certainly have never gotten into since. But Sail Magazine had asked me to write an article. I was interested in writing from the time I was a kid, so I wrote them an article. That led to others. And so from that time on, from 1982 really to when I've been kind of mostly retired the last couple of years, writing became about half of my living. But I wasn't done with actual boating. In fact, it was all integrated. I was continuing to do delivery, shorthanded races. The next year, I got back up on the horse and sailed the Fast 40, a 40-foot long, 4,000-pound, 8-foot wide ULDB with half the weight in lead at the bottom of a very deep keel. A very light boat, and raced it to Bermuda. And despite the fact that the rudder fell off, managed to get there. Kathy called it the Cracker Box Palace, but we had a good time with that boat. I also wasn't done with ocean survival. People immediately flocked to me for some reason, thinking I was a survival expert. Well, I wasn't a survival expert. I just was an expert in my survival. And but it got me on the train of actually doing lots of research and getting involved on a number of different levels of training myself and teaching training. This is my early concept of a dynamic life raft, which basically means the thing sails. Because for me, the typical life raft, which is designed primarily for offshore oil rigs and down planes and things that want you to sit in one place, well, that was not the best raft for me, or for a lot of shorthanded sailors. And I actually did when I was working at Cruising World, did a study of the Baileys and the Robertsons myself, and if we could have just gone within 15 degrees of dead downwind and gone 3/4 to a 1 knot of speed, we could have all markedly shortened our drifts. In my case, had I been able to reach across the wind and gone 3 knots, I would have been a week to the Cabo Verde Islands. It's also my first wife and I had separated before I left on solo, and I was friends with a woman, Kathy Massimini, my now wife, and she also loved the sea. So here we are together doing a boat review for Chuck Payne design. But this was the heyday of magazines. I don't know if anybody can even remember magazines anymore. Here we are on Zoom, but Sail magazine had hired me to do a lot of coverage of the shorthanded racing scene. And this was a kind of a period of shift from the early days where people were out there really sailing experimental boats, and it was strictly amateur. Although there was a little bit of sponsorship in those early days. In the early 80s, it was a transition to full sponsorship, and for this kind of racing to really become dominated by the French, who had the budgets and the boats. Paul Ricard, the first successful offshore racing hydrofoil stabilized trimaran, was among these boats. But notably, it was not the first successful offshore hydrofoil. That was on the West Coast, a boat named Willywaw that in the late 60s and early 70s crossed the Pacific, a little 32-footer. But there was a lot of interest at that time in the transition from strict multi-hulls to hydrofoils. Here's Callahan, another hydrofoil stabilized trimaran. It was clear that the foils were very useful in keeping boats more level, to help with pitch dampening, as well as being sort of a reef in the sail. But there was still other traditional boats. Here on the left is Jester, which was in the very first Observer single-handed transatlantic race, and did many, many more. And those were still participating, in this case in 1984. On the right is Race Against Poverty, an Adrian Thompson design, which was the first water ballasted boat since Eric Taberley's Pinduik that had raced single-handed across the Pacific, in which in that boat was sort of invented water ballast. So there's a lot of invention still going on, a lot of experimentation. And I was both covering these races and doing deliveries for boats like Nigel Irons' City of Birmingham, a 40-footer, which is still sailing around somewhere. Quite a good boat, built all out of Kevlar. Moxie, which won the 1980 single-handed transatlantic race, being driven by Phil Weld at age 65, I believe. And on the right is Thursday's Child, Warren Lure's very radical water ballasted open 60, the days of the early open 60s. And even small boats. I still had a love for small boats. And so here we are doing a delivery across the Atlantic in Crowther 33-foot trimaran, which I guess was considered a small boat at the time. But see, none of that's really fazed me. I didn't really look at boats like that. I was comfortable in small boats. But I did in 1986 sail an early open 60, the Joubert Nivolt design, Biscuit Lou, the cookie cutter as we called her, in the double-handed transatlantic, during which I got frostbite in the middle of summer over the Grand Banks. Very, very tough race. Robin Knox Johnson, who was doing the race, reported that it was the worst weather he'd ever seen. I'm not sure if that was really the case or if he was just being generous, but he did pass us. So I know that we had pretty much the same weather. And it was pretty stormy, but this boat was a delight to sail. It had some teething problems to it, but would later do the Around Alone race with Guy Bernardin as the skipper. And we did pretty well in that race too. But racing has never really exactly been my thing. I've done a number of offshore races, but it's not really where I live. I look at sailing and boats as a wonderful lifestyle. And but I love design, and I love advances in design. I've never been of the opinion that design does not evolve like everything else. And so here's also sailing in Newport with a friend's boat, Phil Stagel, who set a record, east-west record with this boat during the 1988 single-handed transatlantic. Also another foil stabilized trimaran, and also one of the early boats with a large carbon wing mast. The whole thing was 60 feet long, 60 feet wide. The main hull, I don't think, was more than 6 feet wide and weighed all of 6,000 pounds. Back to the little. A friend of mine, Patrick Childress, who had unbelievably circumnavigated in a Cal 27, came back and he decided he wanted a new adventure. He wanted something small, and this ties back into the dynamic rafts and survival in a strange kind of way, because he wanted to sail a 13-foot boat around the world. And would I design one? So I thought, it's a challenge. First of all, the boat's got a displacement length ratio, has to have a displacement length ratio of about 450, something like Slocum's Spray. And all the micro voyagers up to that point were not professionally designed, and they were mostly really poor performers. If they did 50 or 60 miles in a day, it was a good day. We wanted to do something different, so we experimented with some different, a different kind of hull shape and lightweight construction. With all S-class and honeycomb core and stuff like that, and just one big platform inside the boat that he could sit on a beanbag chair wherever he want and have his gear stored in bags. And actually, literally, you could sleep 3 people on this boat if you actually wanted to. And this boat was kind of a lot of fun for me. Because first of all, I didn't have to take it around the world, and secondly, it was a grand experiment. And when he left St. Croix on the way to Panama, he averaged 90 miles a day in this little boat, which was about 90% of theoretical hull speed. So I think it was quite a successful boat, but unfortunately, due to navigational error, falling asleep, and currents, it ended up on the rocks in the Galapagos and spent 5 days being bashed apart on the rocks there. But my wife and I, Kathy and I, in the meantime, actually came into something called money. We had never had any money in our life. We had rebuilt a 100-year-old farmhouse, and we're living pretty close to the bone, often without, I don't know, for years without indoor plumbing or anything like that, while I rode adrift. Because when I came back from bobbing about the ocean like an idiot, a lot of people were interested in that, but I had to put my life back together. I lost everything I had, and you don't make a lot of money writing articles and things like that. So I had also gone back to work with Bob Wallstrom, who had hired me back in the 70s to work at Yacht Design Institute. And we had developed, we were developing an accredited degree program in small craft naval architecture there. And it was also the beginning of the days of computer-aided design, where one of the big lessons was, of course, garbage in, garbage out. We had students who were playing with these computer-aided designs, and some of these boats were like, oh, wow, that's really beautiful. But unfortunately, you've just designed a 40-foot cruising boat that weighs 3,000 pounds, and you're never going to do it. So I was learning all the time, but not making much money. But I had taken off time to write Adrift, which I did over a period of about almost 4 years. And when Adrift was published, I suddenly got a check for more money than I'd made in my adult life. And so, of course, the first thing we wanted to do was waste it on a boat. So we went out and we bought a Carter 33, which was originally designed as the 3/4 tonner, an IOR 3/4 tonner. And she had her problems, but she was a really tough boat, a really good sea boat. And so we refit her and spent about a year sailing down through Bermuda, where we were stuck for about a month in the fall and actually cruised Bermuda. I don't know if any of you ever make it to Bermuda, but most people just use it as a stopping point. And it's actually a very interesting place to cruise. It's a whole archipelago. And we spent a month there with gales virtually every day, and then sailed south as far as Grenada, where I delighted in seeing commercial sail still being used. This is about 1989, 1990 now. On the left is a smuggler boat. You could always tell the smuggler boats because they had new winches and things. Or the native craft used for fishing and even sailing, taking cargo down to Venezuela. And to this day, I'm still kicking myself for not somehow putting our boat to bed there and taking one of these voyages, because I'm sure they're all gone now. While we were in the Caribbean, we were hanging out with some guys from Minnesota, and they had a newspaper article that had come in. And the newspaper article was American with 3 Kiwis was supposedly adrift on an overturned trimaran for 4 months that had come back ashore and crashed back into New Zealand. And the authorities were doubting this ever happened to them. And I said, well, isn't this very typical? Because not only for myself, but for other survivors I had talked to, and I'd spent now many years talking to all kinds of survivors, not just ocean survivors, but many ocean survivors. And the general rule of thumb is when you have the bad taste to show up alive after everybody's written you off, it's an embarrassment. So the first thing out of people's mouths is, this couldn't possibly have happened. And that happened to me, as well as Jim Nalepka in the crew of the Rose Noel. And irony upon irony, when I arrived home in Maine, there was a letter waiting for me from Jim Nalepka, whom I never met or even heard of before that newspaper article. And he said, well, when he came ashore, he went to a party and there was a copy of Adrift on the table. And so he picked it up and read it, and they wanted to tell their story, particularly him and his best friend aboard, Rick Hellriegel, who was ill and never recovered, ended up dying of a brain tumor. And so Jim came and lived with us. And in fact, he lived in Carpuzzi, our Carter 33, hauled up in our yard, which we used as an apartment, and lived with us for 6 months while I wrote Capsize, the story of these 4 men who went off on a beautiful 40-foot trimaran, got flipped over, and spent 4 months bobbing around in the Pacific Ocean. And they learned many things from that. One was that the currents didn't work the way people thought they did. And there was a lot of evidence to support their story, everything from the kinds of mollusks that were growing on the hull to a note in a bottle that was thrown off a boat, at a cruising boat, pretty close to where they had capsized and drifted back the same pattern they did back to New Zealand. But the core of that story, it was interesting to me. Here were 4 very different men. And when men were talking about men's issues for the first time and those sorts of things. And Jim was a very sort of new age sensitive guy to me. And the Kiwis, especially the skipper, was kind of a very old age guy like me. It was a very interesting study in men's relations and how personalities, just like for myself within myself in Adrift, they all balanced. They had a lot of conflict, and each one had their own particular skills to add to the crew. And it took them a long time, but before the journey was over, they learned that everybody's personality in certain circumstances could be a detriment, and in other cases could be a real bonus. For me in Adrift, anybody who's read it knows that I kind of divided myself up into 3 different personalities: a rational part, an emotional part, and a physical part. And each of these parts had sometimes competing needs and desires, and I had to learn to balance that even within myself. So this is kind of a carry on from that, but just looking at different personalities. Kathy and I would often sail together. In this case, in Norway, along the coast of Norway, one of the most beautiful places in the planet, artist paradise. North as far as Newfoundland on this coast, another wondrous area, very dramatic. And I also went to work for Cruising World, which Mo mentioned, where I was ended up as senior editor. And before, I had dealt with a lot of the technical material there. And before I left, was able to do something I had never done before, which was spend a passage with more than 2 other people on board. It was a bit, I was a bit nervous about it. We had 14 people on this boat. And, but like putting out a magazine, like doing a lot of things I've done since, I learned that I needed people and that we could do things on this boat that no single person could do. I had a wonderful time, really enjoyed all the personalities, and would not shy away from doing a similar kind of voyage myself. I thought it was just a wonderful experience. That was, by the way, that's part of the BT Challenge, the single-handed crewed race around the world. Robin Knox Johnson has one. There's so many opportunities now for people to get offshore that just haven't existed before. Doing a delivery on Monhegan from the Caribbean to England with my old friend Chris Latcham, who helped me sail Napoleon solo across the Atlantic, and Kathy. We just continued to do both offshore sailing here approaching the Azores. And 2000, the year 2000 was a really remarkable year for me, because not only did we do delivery to England, but I came back and my friend Russell Brown called me. Now, Russell is Jim Brown's son. He is, I call him the Michelangelo of composites. Just an incredibly skilled craftsperson, and grew up on boats. And his thing was proas. Not to be weird, but just because he thought they were the most bang for the buck, and he could live very simply on these boats. This was his third. The first was a 30-footer he built at age 16 and disappeared basically on it to escape high school, and never looked back. And he's really the only modern designer, at least at that point, who had refined the Pacific style proa, so-called flying proa, because it keeps the small ama to the weather side. Just a fantastic boat to sail, so much fun, but it is a canoe. It's a 3,000-pound canoe. And Russell wanted me to help him sail it to Tahiti. His goal was to get all the way to Australia. Now, as far as I know, even to this date, there's been no other traditional proa to cross the entire Pacific. I know, of course, there could have been voyages that were not recorded, but this was just the most fun because it came very close to sort of camping on the ocean to me. And it was so much about being there. The only electronics we had a GPS. We steered by the wind in the ocean. And as I point out to people, especially as boats have gotten faster and faster, the shortest distance between 2 points in sea is anything but a straight line. You're sailing with the wind, keep watching the apparent wind. Here we are drying the laundry in the middle of the Pacific. It had to be up pretty high because the boat was, could be pretty wet at times. And here in the Marquesas. And Mo, she mentioned before this started how we had met with our friend Joe Colpitt, another fantastic sailor who had set records in prior boats, and he built the Virgin Fire. And a Virgin Fire is an incredible boat to me. She's 53 feet, so she's pretty big for a home for one person, but it's a great example of a boat that was very comfortable, open and airy. We could have crews of 4 or 5 on board perfectly fine, and you had the benefit of sailing wind speed. It makes your whole world a whole lot different. I continued to be involved in the safety industry, sometimes testing gear, going to conferences and those sorts of things. And I came up with this idea of a folding rib, which was in production for a very short while, and finally brought to fruition that idea of a dynamic safety craft that actually was a very, very practical dinghy. We used it in Australia for a couple of years on our boat Trifina, a 40-footer a big sister to the very first trimaran I built. Pretty luxurious. The boat was well built, but we had to totally refit it because everything we picked up broke. And after a couple of years of living in Australia, we came back to the States, where we turned back to small boats. Cruising World asked me to do explore the Main Island Trail. We have 3,000 islands in Maine. Many of them are public or have some kind of public access. And we wanted to see what we could do with the sailboat. So we took this little Playcat, little rotomolded boat, and sailed her along. This is the coast of Maine, which we love so much. Also continue to do here life raft testing for Cruising World and writing articles about things like ditch kits. And then in 2000, I can't remember, 8 or 9 or so, I got a very unusual call. A gentleman named Ang Lee called me, and I had known Ang Lee. Both Kathy and I love movies, and we had seen virtually all of Ang Lee's films. And he wanted to come up and talk to us about this crazy project he wanted to do, which was to film a book called The Life of Pi. As it happened, when we were in Australia, Lynn Pardee had sent me a copy of Life of Pi and said, look at page something or other. And let me see, Captain Bligh and Poon Lim and myself were mentioned in that book. So I thought that was a little bit of an irony, and I couldn't resist. So they came up, we took them out for a sail. Both he and David McGee, here pictured next to him, the scriptwriter, had never been on a boat before. So we took them out for a little sail on this 100-year-old friendship sloop. And we had exchanged sea stories and movie stories. And before I knew it, a year or so later, I got a call from a producer who said, you want to come to Taiwan? Well, I had just been out of hospital and literally had tubes hanging out of me. And I said, well, I can't come right now, but give me a little bit. And so they decided Ang Lee was the 4th director who tried to make this film. But he was bringing it to fruition finally. It was incredibly complex, maybe suitable for making a cartoon or something out of it, but most people in the film business considered it unfilmable. There's an old adage in the film business, never make a movie on the water, with kids, or with animals. So our joke was, so we're doing all 3, and then 3D, which was a new technology at the time. We built, not me, I didn't have anything to do with it, but a lot of the filming was done in this wave tank, which was 1.8 million gallons of water with big bays pushing out waves. And part of my job became, which I never expected, to test this wave tank, to develop patterns that made some kind of sense and looked kind of realistic, and to always give Ang a different surface of water. Ang wanted to make, which really attracted me to this project, he said, I want to make the ocean into a major character. And I'd never heard that before. Usually ocean films look like they were filmed in somebody's bathtub or living room or something or other. It just looks dead to me. It doesn't look real. And so he said, I want you to bring authenticity to this, and I want you to make it convincing. And for me, it was my chance to bring an experience of being adrift decades forward, to share a lot of that with the world in a whole different format. So I think that you can see, if you watch the film, things about the ecosystem that kept the boy alive. I designed and built props. I worked with virtually every department, makeup, second units, first units, everything except, here's the wave tank operating at night in a storm sequence. Coaching the actor before every setup, you have a certain scene and he'd have to do certain things. And so I'd have to show him, oh, well, this is the way you might poke away a shark or something like that. Everything but the tigers. And for those people out there who always say, oh, well, all those tigers are CG and Life of Pi, it's not true. We had actually 4 tigers. A couple years later, I got a call from Ron Howard. I never expected to be in the movie business in my life, but that just goes to show where serendipity takes you. And he was making In the Heart of the Sea, a wonderful book by Nathaniel Philbrick that chronicles the demise of the whaling ship Essex that inspired Melville to write Moby Dick. As everybody says, it's the real Moby Dick story. Here's one of the longboats. We're out training. This gentleman standing in the bow is Tom Holland, the new Spider-Man, who was just about 18 at that time. And it also took me, again, full circle back to the Canary Islands. Here it was filmed in Gomera, where I was 40 years beforehand on Napoleon Solo. And although I look a bit like a castaway here on the left with Faye, the makeup artist, and on the right, I actually found myself on my 1 second, literally 1 second, a celluloid film. But Maine is where we call home. Kathy and I like to consider ourselves sort of citizens of the world. We've lived in a number of places on boats, and but Maine is always our home of homes. And so, but while we're here, we continue to sail when we can, whether it's open 50 like Cray Valley Research here, which has been a very successful racing boat on the East Coast and did a round the world race very successfully, or a Herreshoff New York 50 like Merrily in a classical Eggemogan Reach race. It's always a delight. Now, I'm old now. I'm 68, and I've had a lot of health problems. So I only dream now of those days in offshore sailing to the great briny deep, here doing a delivery on a Hinckley 50 down to Bermuda. And I probably will never see those deep waters again, unfortunately. But I am always reminded that we all come full circle. Even the America's Cup is finally coming full circle. Here is Baker's Monitor, which in the 1950s reached at least 30 knots. Some people claim it sailed at 40 knots. The first successful sailing hydrofoil monohull. And although my early experience with hydrofoils was all with multi-hulls, they finally come back to roost on a single-hulled boat. Just as we've come to roost here in our home waters. And we have a little trimaran, so perhaps I'll go back to the days like I did with the O'Day Mariner, exploring this wonderful crinkly coast of ours. But wherever you are, wherever you're going, I wish you the best of voyages. And we are all incredibly lucky that right out our back doors is a ticket to 2/3 of the world if we just have a boat. So good luck and good sailing. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We can open it up for questions if you want. Go ahead and type them under the chat, and I'll ask Stephen. But that was neat. You included the gazoos. What people don't know is Joe Colpett is this amazing guitar player, singer as well, and none of us could compete with him. So
oh, I don't know about that. But Mo is a great singer and artist herself. And I have to say, you know, I almost put it in there. It's the only time in my life we stopped in Bermuda. And I don't know if you remember, but Joe had some friends come out to the boat and play guitar with him. And it's the most creative use of a Lumar block I ever saw. It was a guy played slide guitar with a Lumar block.
Right. I remember that. Oh my gosh. So I've got a question from Greg Felton. He said, I'd be interested in his thoughts about the book and/or movie Unbroken and the 47-day survival Olympian Louis Zamperini after his plane crashed in the Pacific.
Ooh, good question. I so wanted to meet him and ask him a question about that, actually, because there's only one thing that didn't make sense to me. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like. You know, Eddie Rickenbacker went down in the war in a raft. The rafts were very unsophisticated at that time, just brutal because you had no cover at all. And I can't imagine what that was like. Of course, Unbroken's a fantastic book. It's really interesting. And you know, anything that I may have survived pales in comparison to what people like that withstood. But the only question I had was that there is an episode in there where the raft is shot by this plane, And for the life of me, I don't know how they kept the raft afloat, because I have been in rafts with faulty valves. I've been, I've played a lot. I've played with quite a few rafts in my life now. And patching a raft is not an easy feat. As I say, I had a tear in the bottom of my raft caused by the Dorado, and it was a nightmare for me to try to get that fixed. And while it wasn't fixed, it was horrible. It was unlivable in the raft and took me right to the edge. So that's the only question I had about it. But uh, I am so thankful for all those people who went before, because they slowly but surely have improved our survival craft, where we have pretty good survival craft now. Actually, you have a very good chance of surviving a pretty long time if you have the right equipment.
These are coming in fast and furious. Leon Malmed wants to know, were you able to cook your catch?
Oh, no, no, no takeout, no cooking. But in a way,
No
yes.
roasting the birds either, I suppose.
Right, right. Well, that gets down to sort of, I don't know, it touches on a few things. One is, obviously in that situation, you're on a pretty much an all protein diet. Although I made sure that I ate pretty much all parts of the fish, because they might, organ meats and things might have vitamins and things that the flesh didn't. And I would eat as much fresh as I could as soon as I could, in part because it takes fluid to digest proteins in food, and the drier it gets, the more cooked it is, the more moisture that would take. And I had only about maybe a pint and a quarter or so of water a day, where I wasn't really swallowing water. I was just take a sip and it would be sort of absorbed by my mouth. So dehydration was a really difficult problem for me. But if the fish were pretty big, so I would strip them up and hang them up to dry, which essentially is cooking them. So I had this like hardtack for days when I didn't have fresh fish. But I also would like to note this, that, I thought, oh my God, you read these survival stories and go, oh, I could never do that. I could never eat this. I could never eat uncooked fish or whatever. Well, besides the fact that sushi is very popular now, and I like sushi, I found it was very interesting how your body changes your psychology, because the longer the voyage went, the less I could taste salty stuff. So if I had a little bit of saltwater pollution in fresh water, I would still drink it. But I was able, the salt water tasted less and less salty as time went on, and the flesh of the fish tasted less and less salty, so it wasn't as delicious as it was. But what I really looked forward to, what my body really wanted, and what I wanted, were all the fresh fish guts. Give me a fresh fish liver. Give me a fresh fish eyes. Oh, those are little nuggets of fluid and things like that. And I know it sounds kind of horrible now, but if you're ever stuck in that situation and you're actually starving, your body will change your psychology.
Interesting. So from Hans and Courtney Lee, there are new members. They've got 3 little girls, and they just said, "Thank you so much, Stephen. This was absolutely amazing. Our girls were riveted. You're inspiring the next generation of sailors."
Good, good.
And, again,
it makes me so happy, actually. Now that I'm sort of a land cruiser for the moment. If I told you the other night, I may not have swallowed the anchor, but I got the fluke lodged pretty firmly down my throat. And so I watch videos of young people out there sailing and doing their thing, and it's greatly encouraging. It's just like, I don't know if you know Dave and Jaja Martin, but their daughter is out there now cruising around, and it's just so heartening to see people carrying on the tradition. And I'm sure that just as my history in the sailing that I've done and the boats I was involved with reflects our society then, so it will in the future. And they're a part of that and making what that is.
Yeah, I think their first boat was a common boat out here, a Cal 20, that they actually, wasn't it a Cal 20? They had 3 children aboard that boat, and he had modified it.
It was a 25, actually, the same boat that I sailed. And he had totally rebuilt, kind of rebuilt it all and everything the way. And really, that is incredible to me, how you could go around the world with a whole family in a 25-foot boat. That's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
remarkable.
So Leo Malmed again wants to know, which sailing adventure movie would you recommend?
Ooh, good question. Sailing. Well, you know, I love these, you know, documentaries. Actually, I was brought to tears by Deep Water. The Donald Crowhurst story is one of the greatest sea stories ever told. The book, The Strange Last Voyage of Donald
Yeah.
Crowhurst, is fascinating. I mean, it's a Greek tragedy, but all the stories that came out of that, other books are things like The Long Way by Bernard Matessier, one of the greatest, most romantic sort of sea stories of all time. Unfortunately, not made into a film. But Deep Water talks about the Golden Globe race, and I think is a tremendous documentary. In terms of sort of Hollywood movies, you know, one of my favorites actually is the old Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy, and it incorporates some footage of the old fishing schooners off Gloucester taken by Sterling Hayden.
Nice.
It's just you know, it's a simple movie, again, done in a studio, but it sells well. And of course, when I was a kid, I went and saw Moby Dick, which I thought was just, oh my, that was cat's meow for me. But modern sailing movies, I haven't seen too many that are great. Of course, I'm very proud of Life of Pi, even though it's not really a sailing movie. But and I'm not just for the things that I contributed to it, but everybody put in 110% on that film, and they were all just the most incredibly talented people. And I wish I had known about the film business when I was young, because I probably would have gotten into it. I love working behind the scenes and creating stuff like that. But hopefully there will be some new sailing films, but it's very, very difficult to make films on the water.
Yeah. Okay, from Elena. She says, "Hi, Stephen. I loved your book. I remember you shooting the rubber duck with the spear gun and frantically repairing the boat. How did you pull that off?"
Ooh.
Is this the fork story?
Yeah, the fork story. Yeah, it's a little difficult to explain. It's much easier to kind of look at it in a drift, because I have diagrams with circles and arrows and paragraphs on the back of each one. The Dorado snapped the shaft of the spear right off of the handle and kind of ran it along the tube. So I had a tear like your mouth. And the problem is that I mean, we have some better patching things, these patching clamps for those situations, but I didn't have those. I only had, you know, there were, like I say, there was a lot of things that I had to laugh at, sort of gallows humor. One was the patching kit, which, you know, said it's like what you patch your tire for your bike with, you know, and it said right on it, make sure material's dry before application, which I thought was kind of a hoot. That wasn't going to work. So I tried to stuff a plug in and kind of pucker it up and wrap a string around it. But the problem is, every time I inflated the tube, it would pull that back out straight, and the plug would, you know, the lashings would fall off and everything. And it didn't matter how hard I did. And I tried external restraining lines and all kinds of nonsense, and couldn't figure it out. I'd get a patch to work for a couple of hours or a few hours, and then it would blow out, and I was exhausted, and I'd rubbed a hole through my skin and was getting hundreds and hundreds more saltwater sores, which are these little open ulcers that form on the skin. They can be pretty painful, especially sitting in a salt and crusted environment. So I was pretty down about it. And finally, I was just on the edge of just giving up right then. And water was kind of washing in and out of the raft, because without the bottom tube, you actually only end up with a couple inches of freeboard. So a lot of water's washing in and out of the raft and stuff. Couldn't fish, any of this stuff. And I felt sorry for myself, kind of broke down. And I just felt this presence of all these other people who had survived things before. And it was like that choice that you had to make. And so I forced myself to pull myself up and just go through everything I had in the raft, just name it all. And somehow, for some reason, I had all this junk in with my ditch kit, some of which was useful and some of which wasn't. But I actually had a utensil kit in there, a little stainless steel utensil kit. And it was like, oh, I got a fork. Oh, fork. And this brings to mind also the movies, another Ron Howard movie, Apollo 13. And there's a scene in there where um, they need to scrub the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and the designers and the engineers are all sitting there and go, well, I wasn't designed for this. I wasn't, you know, the engineer finally, the head of the thing finally says, I don't care what it was designed to do. What can it do? And that really is key to a lot of these survival situations. I've talked to survivors who signaled aircraft with credit cards that are no longer useful as a credit card, but they're shiny, reflective surfaces. A survivor who navigated taking biscuit paper and folding it into angles until he could measure the angle of the North Star, which is much what I did when I made a sextant out of pencils to measure the horizon. So the fork was, oh, it's not a fork, but guess what? It's solid and it's a pin. So again, another irony of survival and dealing with crises is you often have to create a little bit of damage in order to find a solution. Companies know this because they often have to disband a whole part of their company because it's not being productive. So that's what I did. I actually I made more holes in the raft above and below the lips, put a pin in there through the plug, and then that gave me something very secure. I could wrap a very tight lashing around behind that, and then no matter how hard I pumped up the bottom tube, it never came undone. And in fact, ended up holding the air better than the top tube.
Nice. That was a lifesaver. Um, so Leon, the name of the book is Adrift, and he wants to know, did anyone try to find you? Which,
yes, as a matter of fact. But that's sort of a catch-22 kind of story. My parents were aware that I was missing, but you have to remember that I figured that I would take about a month to do the passage, and I lost the boat about a week, 10 days in, I guess about a week, 8 days into the passage. So I wasn't really overdue for several weeks, but my mother had a bad dream and of me struggling for air and things like that. And they were worried. And when I didn't show up, they started looking into it. My father flew search and rescue missions during the Second World War as part of one of his jobs. And my older brother, was a diver, professional diver. They were both very familiar with the ocean. And so they tried to put together a map of what might have happened to me. They guessed that I lost the boat in the blow that I did lose the boat in, not for the same reasons, but they plotted a course which is actually quite parallel to mine. And but still, it was 100 miles away. And if you can imagine searching an area which would have been, to see me would have been, 200 miles in diameter in the middle of the ocean. It was just impossible for somebody to actually search for me. And the Coast Guard at first wouldn't believe that I'd even left the Canary Islands. My parents had to go, there's a big rigmarole to prove to them that I had left there. And when they finally accepted that, at first it was like, well, he's not gone long enough. So we'll wait for a while, and now he's gone too long and a search wouldn't be fruitful. I don't blame them, frankly, because unless you have a specific SOS approximate position, like through an EPIRB or something like that, it probably would have been fruitless for anybody to look for me, but to actually do a search pattern, that sort of thing. But people did put together a pretty accurate picture of what had happened to me.
very cool. Greg Felton again says regarding Louis Zamperini, Greg's flight instructor, her name is Iris Critchell, who is 99 years old and still 100%, was a great friend of his and the source for a lot of the Unbroken material. She swam in the 1936 Berlin Olympics in which he ran. I don't know if she spoke with Louis about patching the raft, but he's going to ask.
Oh, good. That's great. Maybe I'll get my answers.
Yeah. You can, I'll put you in touch.
Okay.
Jace Mack he says, you mentioned your fear of a man overboard at sea. Any thoughts about turning a boat locked into downwind sail plan to recover a man overboard?
I'm not sure what you
I'm
mean by
not sure either.
locked.
Turning a boat locked.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means, locked in. I mean, I guess if you like, if you have the autopilot on
Oh,
or something
downwind
like that.
sail plan. Oh, you just drop whatever your spinnaker is.
Yeah, I mean,
Bring
it's
in
more
your
difficult,
main and turn
obviously.
around. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, U.S. Sailing and lots of other people have diagrams and things about how best to do that, and it can be done, but losing. I am just so blessed that I've never lost somebody overboard, because I have had friends who have lost people overboard. In fact, I had one family when we were doing the flyaway trip, the 33-foot Crowther across the Atlantic. We stopped in the Azores, and there was a family there, and they had this little boy who was the cutest thing. He was playing house on the foredeck, built with cardboard boxes and things like that. And when we left, I heard back from them once we got back to the States. They were going to Holland, and it was the safest possible boat you could have. It had bulwarks, and then rails above that. A very traditional, old, heavy boat. And this 10-year-old boy had already been across the Atlantic 3 times. And they came up one day and he wasn't there. He had
Oh my
probably
gosh.
sat up on a rail or something and gone, and I can't imagine anything more heartbreaking. So I don't know, but there are lots of, I'm sure your yacht club itself probably does drills or has that kind of information.
Yeah. I think Ashley Perrin was here earlier. I know she still is.
Yeah.
Um,
Stop
Ken,
the boat.
yeah.
The first
First and
thing,
foremost.
stop the boat.
Yeah. So Ken Rogers says, I read your book Adrift a long time ago and loved it. Can San Francisco Yacht Club members buy signed copies from you? We don't do it through here, but is there a way for somebody to contact you and get a book?
You know what? To be honest,
Yeah.
I did that for a while, and it
Don't do
got
it
to be
anymore.
too.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just too cumbersome. It takes too long to do it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry, but
No worries.
someday if you see me, I'd be happy to sign it.
Somebody said he just quoted Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant. And lastly, we've got, I noticed Stephen's drawings from the Life Raft and also the beautiful illustrations of the journey, as well as the concept for a sailing raft. Is he also an illustrator? This is from Meredith.
Oh, nice of you, Meredith. I don't know. As I said at the beginning, I've done a lot of different things in my life. People would ask me what I did for a living, and for the longest time, I didn't know what to say, because it got into this whole drivel of everything. And do I design boats? Do I build boats? Do I teach design? Am I a journalist? I don't know. I'm kind of a lot of things, and none of the above at the same time. So for a while, I said, "Oh no, I'm retired," like at age 25 or 30 or something. But a friend of mine pointed out, he says, no, that doesn't work. You have to retire from something. And so, yes, I have done a little illustration. I've illustrated both my books, and Michael Greenwald did a survival book called Survivor, a real tome of sort of ocean survival information. And I did some illustrations for him and some other things through the years, but I don't do any one thing.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I think that's it. There's no other questions. So what's I going to say? For everybody who's still here, this will be on social media tomorrow. And so you'll be able to see it. It's recorded. We'll have it for forever. And I want to say one thing to remember. Now I understand when we were in Bermuda, you'd been there so many times before. I just really learned tonight how you'd been there for so many times, because all I remember is we had to leave because we were all going to go into liver failure from all the people that entertained us with you.
Oh yeah. I
never
you have
drank
to
so
bring
much
a spare
alcohol in my life.
Right. It's a whole survival experience in itself to go to Bermuda, just because of the incredible hospitality there. And
Oh
you
my
go to
God.
somebody's house for breakfast and you have to have a mimosa or something. So Yeah.
I do. I
Yeah.
remember leaving thinking I got to go to rehab.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, we love Bermuda. We still have friends there, and it's a wonderful place. It's actually it's a great for us on the East Coast. I don't think you have anything quite like this on the West Coast. It's it's basically a 5 day, anywhere. Well, it depends on how fast your boat is, but even a relatively slow boat, it's no more than a week away from the East Coast, and you have to cross the Gulf Stream. So for racing, it's tactically really interesting because the Gulf Stream wanders all over the place and has eddies and all this other kind of stuff. And the weather is very different, and you go from cold waters into tropical or sort of semi-tropical waters. Um, it's just it's a great destination and a very unique place, and the people there have always treated us more than kindly.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Stephen, I cannot thank you enough for doing this, really. And it was a treat for me to get to see you and talk to Kathy earlier and stuff. It was really, really neat.
Yeah.
And, I hope you come out sometime.
I hope we can too. I hope that I don't know. I hope the virus goes away, and I hope our country sees better days
Days
than it
ahead.
does right now. But I also have to remind you, I was born in 1952. I was taught duck and cover exercises as a child, as a 5-year-old and
Yeah.
6-year-old. We've come through a lot in this country, so I have faith that we will get through all of this as
Okay.
well. So be well, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.